Welcome to week 12. This week we're going to be discussing in our discussion forums chapters 14 and 15, which concern negative and positive externalities. My video today is going to discuss chapter 14, negative externalities. I'm also going to allow you in the discussion forum to discuss positive externalities if you would like, even though I'm just lecturing on negative externalities. Also, if you happen to find a topic in the news media related to pollution that's being done in certain industries or businesses, and you would like to show how you would employ one of our techniques that we're going to learn today to remove this market failure, I'm happy to allow that as a topic in the discussion forums. You'll want to apply the same rubric to the grading for that summary of the news article and the techniques you would use to employ to remove pollution and therefore to remove the market failure of pollution. So let's take a look at environmental protection and negative externalities this week. So what are externalities? Externalities are when a market exchange affects a third party outside of the transaction or external to the transaction. The example that's given in the textbook of this is country music. If your neighbor is listening to country music and they're listening to it very loudly and you do not like country music, so you're having to listen to it too, they would be playing the country music and listening to it, but they're imposing a negative externality on you. If you like country music, this is a positive externality. So what's happening is when they're playing the loud music, there are spillover effects, and these impact third parties in the presence of externalities. So we have both negative and positive as I've illustrated. A negative externality is a situation where a third party suffers from a market transaction. And a positive externality is a situation where a third party benefits from the market transaction. So if someone's playing country music very loud next door, they're listening to it, but you're having to listen to it too. And if you like it, you are benefiting from the country music being played, and this is a positive externality. If you don't like it and you're suffering, you're experiencing a negative externality. Another example is cigarette smoke. If I'm smoking a cigarette and I'm consuming it as the primary consumer, I've purchased the cigarettes from the producers who produce cigarettes as the consumer. That smoke could be a negative externality to you. Now, to most people, I don't think we would consider cigarette smoke to be a positive externality. So when that smoke wafts into your office building or past you on the street, that would be considered a negative externality because it's a situation where you're a third party. You're not the person who purchased the cigarette and you're not the company who sold the cigarette, but you are suffering from that market transaction when someone is consuming the cigarette. So let's take a look at an example. And the example I have today is concerning the tanning industry. So the tanning industry, which creates animal hides and turns them into leather, produces a good amount of pollution. Most of the pollution in the tanning process comes from the chemical of chromium being introduced into the surrounding environment. There is also animal byproducts and parts that are introduced into the environment, but chromium is especially toxic and it can pollute water, which eventually harms humans and the animals that come into contact or live in that polluted water. So let's assume that in the industry where the production of animal hides causes this chromium pollution, that without regulation, the free market is exhibiting a market failure, that we are seeing this pollution happen. And here is our free market. So we have the price of animal hides and the quantity of animal hides and the supply and the demand for those animal hides. So currently when there is pollution occurring, we know that the water is being contaminated and people and animals are being harmed by it by getting sick or dying, that the quantity of animal hides supplied and demand in the industry is 4,500 at a price of $75 per hide. So we know that this is demonstrating a market failure because we've said there are pollution and therefore there are externalities, and these tend to be negative externalities. So a market failure is a situation in which the market fails to allocate resources in a way that balances social costs and benefits. We know that the pollution is occurring because people and animals are being harmed by the chromium that's being introduced into their water sources. This pollution represents a market failure where the suppliers of the animal hides, the industry, and the buyers of the animal hides, the consumers who maybe are businesses that are buying animal hides to make purses and shoes and leather seats for cars, they're not being affected by this pollution, or minimally so, but third parties are. So if the free market is not finding an efficient solution, how can we remedy the market failure situation? And there's two different perspectives on this. We can use command and control regulation versus market-oriented environmental tools. And command and control regulation is an older thought process as to how to remedy the situation. Command and control are laws that specify allowable quantities of pollution and may also detail the technologies that need to be used to remedy the pollution, so to eliminate the pollution or to mitigate some of it at least. This sort of solution ensures that firms only are allowed to pollute by a certain allowable amount. They're either going to reduce pollution or employ technologies which allow them to reduce pollution. So they're going to reduce their production to a level where they're only going to be polluting by the legal specified amount, or they're going to be producing the same amount and using certain technologies which might even be specified to reduce the pollution to the allowable amount. So both outcomes would impact the supply curve, shifting it to the left. If firms are going to be reducing production, which by reducing production reduces the amount of pollution, we know this would shift our supply curve to the left. And why would this shift our supply curve to the left? Because the supply for the industry is simply the supply of all of the individual firms. Therefore, if all of the individual firms in the industry are going to have to reduce the amount they are producing, we know this would reduce the supply, because the supply curve is the horizontal summation of the individual supply curves for each firm, summing to create the industry supply curve. So supply would be reduced, and what would happen is we would now have a higher price being charged and less quantity of animal hides being produced. And here we would have what is called our social supply. So our social supply would mean that we've taken into consideration the previous existence of a market failure. So the market failure would be that there's a negative externality of pollution occurring. Now, when we apply this command and control regulation, reducing the total allowable quantity of pollution either through technology or reducing production, and the supply is shifting for each firm, less is being produced, or the technology is imposing a cost, and we know when we have increases in cost, this also shifts the supply curve inward. It's one of our supply shifters, that there would now in equilibrium be, and this was previously 75, so the price would be greater than 75 and fewer than 4,500 units would be supplied and demanded. We would now have an efficient equilibrium, which removes the market failure of creating that negative externality. So there's some issues with command and control systems. There isn't really any incentive to achieve better results than what the law has established. So if the law says we need to reduce pollution in half, or we're only going to allow for half of the currently occurring pollution to be in existence, then that's good, but it might not be reducing pollution all the way, and essentially that social supply would therefore not actually be the efficient supply, because it wouldn't be actually removing all of the pollution. And if all of the pollution isn't removed, and there still are some negative externalities present, so there is some pollution, then there still would be a market failure. Additionally, it's not going to distinguish between firms which can easily achieve the regulation versus those for which it is costly to achieve the regulation. So there could be different types of industries that are polluting different types of things, or maybe they're all polluting the same thing, and in one industry it's actually very cheap to reduce the pollution. Maybe the technology is easy to employ, for example, and therefore it's less costly than in other industries where the technology might be more costly to employ. So therefore it's not going to be fair for one firm versus the next. And also, these types of regulations are subject to compromises in a bureaucratic political process. So we are also assuming that that bureaucratic political process actually has its interests aligned with removing the market failure of the negative externality, which is the pollution. We're assuming that, but that's not always true. So those are some issues with the command and control methods that could be applied. Market-oriented tools are a little more progressive. One market-oriented tool is a pollution charge. So a pollution charge is a tax imposed on the quantity of pollution that a firm can emit, and they call this a pollution tax. They would be taxed on certain levels of pollution produced. Initially, it might be easier to remove the first few units of pollution in the tannery process, for example. This low-hanging fruit is marginally cheap to reduce. The methods might be easy and cheap to employ initially. So let's say that tanneries produce a certain amount of chromium, and that chromium hurts downstream animals and plants even, and people. Now, initially, it might be very easy to remove the first 10 to 15% of chromium, or 30%, or 40 or 50, and then 60 and 70 become more costly, and getting rid of the last amounts of chromium out of that water might be most expensive. Therefore, you're going to reduce the pollution for which the cost to reduce it marginally is less than the tax. So what we kind of see happening is, if we look at more and more units of pollution being produced, it looks kind of like our marginal cost curve from looking at firms in perfect competition or monopoly, for example, right? The cost is generally increasing as we increase units of pollution. So there's less real benefit from being able to reduce the units of pollution here than there is initially, because it costs much less. So as long as the pollution tax is set in a way so that the marginal benefit of reducing the pollution, meaning the cost to reduce that pollution, is less than the tax for the majority of the units of pollution being reduced, then we'll see a drastic decrease in the amount of pollution. This also would shift the supply curve for the industry to the left. Why would the supply curve for the industry be shifted to the left? If we think about our supply shifters, we know that if we impose additional costs on the production process for a firm, or for all of the firms in the industry, this would shift the supply curve to the left. So therefore, just like we saw earlier, we would see the supply curve shift to the left. And so S, our new supply curve, would be our social supply. And hopefully, if most to all of the pollution is reduced by employing this pollution tax, we would see an efficient equilibrium where there is no pollution, where we don't have any negative externalities. And where we do not have any negative externalities means there are no market failures, and therefore we are in efficient equilibrium. Let's take a look at some hypothetical production levels. So initially we were producing at a price of 75 and an equilibrium quantity supplied and quantity demanded. Now let's say that the cost to remove the pollution from the tanning process would impose a $1,000 cost. Would reduce the social supply by $1,000. So our quantity supplied falls from 4,000 to 3,000 at a price of 50. At a price of $75, our quantity supplied would fall from 4,500 to 3,500. At a price of $125, our quantity supplied would fall from 4,500 to 4,000, and at a price of $150, our quantity supply would fall from 5,500 to 4,500. what we initially see is that we would be producing where quantity supplied and quantity demanded, and there still is a market failure here, right? Because we have pollution before we increase the cost of production to reduce that pollution, or we put on the pollution tax, which is also an increase in input costs or production costs for the firm, which impacts their bottom line, shifting the supply curve at a price of 75 and 4,500 being demanded and 4,500 hides being supplied. Now, when we employ this pollution tax, we see that the social supply shifts up and to the left. So our social supply has shifted up and to the left. Now, what is the equilibrium quantity that will be supplied and demanded, and also the price that will be transacted in the market? So we see now that the equilibrium price and quantity is each hide will cost $125 and the quantity demanded will be 4,000 and the quantity supplied will be 4,000. So our new equilibrium supply and demand is that at a price of $125, 4,000 will be supplied and demanded versus 4,500 in our old equilibrium before we employed our pollution tax. So what we see happening is that in equilibrium, a higher price will be charged and fewer units will be transacted. And this would cause us to now have an equilibrium that is including the costs to society of producing those animal hides, which previously we were not including those costs to society and pollution was occurring. This is a case where market failure exists when we are employing free market principles, that there is room for government intervention. And here the government is going to be employing the pollution tax in order to reduce or eliminate pollution, eliminate the market failure, and increasing the price of animal hides by doing that. So some of that increase in technology costs that are going to have to be, technology might be having to be used to remove the pollution, or different things might be done in the production process, which increases the production, the cost of production. Some of that end increase in production costs is going to be passed on to the consumer. So another way that we can effectively deal with the market failure of pollution or negative externalities is also to take a look at marketable permits. So marketable permits are permits that allow a firm to create a certain amount of pollution. I guess it would be one that doesn't cause too much of a negative externality or too much of a market failure to be imposed on people. So the firm can emit a certain amount of pollution, and then these permits are actually tradable. So many permits actually trigger a decrease in pollution allowances over time. So in the first year they would say this much amount of chromium is allowed to be going into the water, and then next year it's going to be less, and so forth and so on over time. So what we actually see happening with marketable permits is that firms will trade these permits between one another. So one firm might say, well, I'm actually not producing that much pollution, so I can sell my permits to another firm which might actually be producing more pollution. And the conclusion is that the firms that will be able to least expensively reduce pollution in their production process will do so. And so this is an efficient solution. Another way to reduce pollution is to more clearly define property rights. So property rights are the legal rights of others on which others are not to infringe. And so if we think about our example of the tannery, and the tannery is polluting, it's releasing chromium into the water. That chromium is potentially harmful to plants and animals and people. Maybe one way of handling that solution to reduce the amount of pollution, which would obviously shift our supply curve inward again and to the left to reflect our social supply for the industry, would be to define the property rights, to say that that firm is, the property that the firm exists on is within this certain space, and therefore the river that is downstream is not their property, and therefore they are not allowed to pollute it. So if they are polluting it, they would then have to take measures under consideration that would make it so that no traces of the chromium are reaching the part of the river that is downstream from them, that is not on their property, and therefore by defining those property rights, they probably would have to employ technologies which would cost them money and increase their production costs, lowering the profitability for firms in the industry. So increase in input costs to production process would shift our supply curve up and to the left, and in doing that, increase the price and reduce the amount of quantity that would be supplied and demanded in the overall industry. So property right definitions are yet another way to protect the environment, and it is a more progressive way than previously looking at command and control. So I urge you to take a look at what you might see out there in the news. See if you find any articles about different businesses or industries that are polluting. And we might not know the scientific ways of employing different technologies to reduce the pollution that's occurring, but maybe we can look at the different types of market-oriented tools we have, such as imposing a pollution charge on the firms in the industry, or allowing for marketable permits to occur, or clearly defining property rights, which might happen to help us reduce pollution, which reduces the negative externality, because pollution is a negative externality. And by reducing that negative externality or eliminating that negative externality, eliminate the market failure, which would cause us to actually produce an efficient quantity supplied and demanded at an efficient price. So let me know if you have any questions on this material. I hope you enjoy your learning for the week, and I look forward to reading your discussion forum posts. Take care, everybody.